this.
We are live. Hey guys.
We're live. All right. Hey everyone, we'll give people a second to kind of float into the room? I think that's probably good. Let's give it, we'll give everyone maybe 60 seconds or so to just join us. But thanks for being here. If you are on time, we appreciate your punctuality, a skill that I don't necessarily have myself, but I am here on time today, so that's a win. We'll just give everyone another 60 seconds or so, and then we'll do some intros and tell you a little bit about what we're talking about today. Thanks for being here. Okay, 1:31. Maybe we'll just kick things off here and let people kind of float in as they do. Welcome to our LinkedIn Live. This is our FPF Halloween special. I am just a dead bill buried on Capitol Hill. My name is Angelique Carson. I can't actually see who's specifically on the live right now, but hopefully a bunch of our old friends. I've been in the space for quite a few years now, and got started at the IPP as a journalist and then spent some time in the tech vendor space working on privacy content. And right now I'm actually taking a wee hiatus from privacy, except for this program, and working at the federal government. I work for the agency that regulates the U.S. Postal Service. It's called the Postal Regulatory Commission. But I'm always happy to dip my toes back into the privacy world, and especially with my friends at FPF, who are always so knowledgeable about this stuff and can help us understand what's happening in the legislative space. And that's what we're going to try and do today. So we're talking a little bit about bills that we've recently seen at the state level, mostly, although we may talk a little bit federally as well, and sort of what they mean. We're talking about bills that did not succeed, but what can that teach us? Why did they fail? And also, are they likely to come back either in some other version, or are they, dead, so dead in the ground forever? The nail has been placed into the coffin. So we'll get into the meat of the conversation in just a moment, but let's kick off some intros. We can learn about who's on with us today. Maybe Adonne, you can get us started. Tell us a little bit about, we know your name, we know you work at FPF, but what's your work look like?
Sure. Thanks, Angelique. So I lead policy work on mobility and location. That covers just about everything that it sounds like. So most vehicles and other micromobilities, in addition to location data and other sensitive data adjacent things. And if I might, it feels like, since there's a holiday afoot, for Halloween today, I am a painter. And so I have a onesie situation on and a paintbrush here, and have, maybe lent my hand to decorating the office a bit.
I love that. Amazing. Thank you so much. I should say that I had some intentions of dressing up, but caught an illness this week, a death cold, if you will. Speaking of zombies and vampires. And so I am today coming as a 30-something former privacy journalist looking at perhaps a transition and navigating those woes. That is my costume today. Jameson, would you tell us a little bit about what you do at FPF?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Jameson Spivack. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at FPF, and I lead the organization's work on immersive technologies, so things like extended reality, neurotechnologies, virtual world, and gaming platforms. And I also lead the organization's work on synthetic or AI-generated content. And I do not have a costume.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's okay that you're here without a costume. We're celebrating, the topic is Halloween, so that is our contribution to the holiday. Bailey, would you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure. So I am on FPF's U.S. legislation team. So I help track and analyze legislation across a variety of topics like comprehensive privacy, health data, data brokers. But I have a special interest in youth privacy and online safety. And this is not a costume, just wanted to put on a festive shirt.
Love it. Love the stripes. Cool. Okay, so those are the intros. We're going to get into the topic here. We're going to try and level set a little bit. I think I like to approach this with a wide net. So there's more to know in this space than any of us have time or energy to know about. So we're going to try and give you sort of the lay of the land, but also the nuance for those of you who are knee deep in this privacy stuff so that everyone can hopefully take something away from this. If you want to help us sort of gauge your interest in each topic or the questions that you have, you can interact with us. So ask questions and we will monitor the chat. We may take some of them as we go along if they're sort of germane to the topic at hand, or we'll save a little bit of time at the end to go through your questions and try and address those. You can also interact with each other on the chat, where you coming to us from and what are you doing? What are you up to? This is really meant to be sort of a friendly conversation where we get to kind of interact with the community and also learn something from each other. If you've got knowledge on the topic, feel free to throw that into the chat as well. All right, let's get started. The way we're gonna do this is we're gonna talk. Each speaker has obviously sort of a different area of expertise, although they're all broadly knowledgeable about this legislative privacy space, obviously, as everyone at FPF is, which is what I love so much about FPF. So we're gonna let each speaker sort of talk about their topic, and I've encouraged all the speakers, if they have thoughts, to sort of treat this in the improv style of yes and so if you have thoughts to offer about what one of your colleagues is talking about, feel free to jump in. And as I mentioned, the community at large is welcome to chat with us in the chat as well. Jameson, let's just start with you. You're going to talk to us a little bit about a bill that failed in Minnesota. And could you tell us a little bit? This is an area that I know nothing about, especially because I've been dipped out of the privacy space for a little bit. I know that there's sort of a new trend happening where we're talking about brain data. So could you tell us a little bit about this bill in Minnesota? What was it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in true Halloween fashion, I want to talk about a zombie's favorite food, which is brains and brain privacy specifically. So in Minnesota, there was a bill introduced in actually February 2023, Senate file 1110. And the Minnesota legislative session is 2 years long, ended earlier this year, so the bill is officially dead. But generally speaking, the bill would have done 4 things. One, it would create a new right to mental data. It would create a set of neurodata rights. It would require consent for collecting data via a brain-computer interface. And then lastly, it would have prohibited the use of neurotechnologies to bypass another person's conscious decision-making. So there's a lot in here that's completely new that I can dive in and can do that later. But I think it's helpful to have a little bit of context about the kinds of technologies and data that we're talking about in this context. So neurotechnologies, which is used often in this bill, refers to a technology that can be directly connected with an individual's nervous system. So that's your central nervous system, which includes your brain and your spinal cord. It's your peripheral nervous system, which is the series of nerves throughout your body that control movement. And then another term that is used in this bill is brain-computer interfaces, or BCI, which is a specific kind of neurotechnology that enables users to interact with computers with their brain or with their neural activity. So as I mentioned, these technologies measure data from and about your nervous system, which controls your movement, and as well as your thoughts and emotions and feelings. And the bill is trying to address that part of it. It's trying to address people's mental activity as opposed to necessarily everything about their nervous system. But because of the way that it's scoped to include all nervous system data, some of that data could also be kind of swept into it. And I'm happy to talk more specifically about what some of these new rights would mean or what some of the obligations are if people have questions.
And I think like one of the things that I've heard, Jameson, about these kinds of bills is that we're not only just talking about like the neural data, but also sort of some of these inferences that can be made from that neural data, right? Some of the criticisms I think about the bill was that like maybe it didn't go scope as far out as covering inferences as well.
Yeah, so in the case of this bill specifically, it's actually the potential issue is that not necessarily that it doesn't go far enough or it doesn't cover enough things, but that it's creating new rights and it's unclear exactly what those rights would give people. So for example, the right to mental data, which is one of the new rights or new sets of rights included in this bill. That includes both the right to mental privacy, which prevents the government from collecting data transcribed directly from brain activity without informed consent, as well as the right to cognitive liberty, which prevents the government from interfering with an individual's decisions regarding the use of neurotechnology. So it's actually, and that's just one of the set of new rights that this bill creates. So it's actually kind of granting new rights to people, where it's not exactly clear what kind of situations would involve some of the things that they are describing in the bill.
Jameson, sorry, can I ask a question? The cognitive liberty term was really interesting to me. Is that like a new emerging term, or does that come from somewhere? Like, where is that? Like, I don't know. It just feels very important. Cognitive liberty.
Yeah, so the term cognitive liberty is most commonly associated with Nita Farahani, who is one of the world's leading experts on neurotechnologies and privacy, or neuroprivacy, or neuroethics more generally. And the term that she prefers to use instead of neuroprivacy or brain privacy or mental privacy is cognitive liberty. And the term is, she prefers the term because it's more general than just specifically focusing on your brain or just specifically on your thoughts. And so it describes a much broader set of abilities and protections. The way that cognitive liberty is used in this bill is not necessarily the exact way that Professor Farahani would necessarily describe it. But you're right in that this term has kind of emerged over the past few years. It's not a completely new term, but it's kind of been emerging in association with more attention on neurotechnologies and neuroprivacy.
And Jameson, how many, I know there have been several different dabbles in like neuro privacy, be it a definition included in other bills, but like how many places actually states cover neural data?
Yeah, so I would contrast this approach in Minnesota, which we've only seen in the U.S. We've only seen this in Minnesota, this kind of rights-based approach, whereas the other approach that has been more common, or at least more successful in the U.S., is an approach that's been taken in Colorado and California. Which is addressing mental privacy through the regulation of neural data using existing consumer privacy laws, as opposed to creating a whole new set of rights. So essentially, both California and Colorado have enacted legislation amending the definition of sensitive data under their existing privacy laws to include neural data. So while Colorado and California's underlying privacy laws vary in how they treat sensitive data, both follow the logic that certain kinds of data are more sensitive than other kinds of data and should be treated differently, should be protected more strongly. And those definitions now include neural data, which is a much, much narrower approach than the rights-based approach in Minnesota. We are creating a whole bunch of new rights. And actually the Minnesota bill doesn't only create rights, it also has a requirement for companies that are providing brain-computer interfaces must collect consent. They must provide notice and obtain a consent for each time they're collecting, using, or sharing data. And then there's also like some prohibitions. So it's creating new rights and there's also obligations for companies that are or entities that are developing or using neurotechnologies.
Jameson, I wanted to ask you, like, I always think it's interesting to look at what are the practical problems that we face with these types of new technologies. I have to imagine that more and more, vendors, companies that manufacture products are interested in using this type of neural technology. And I think my understanding from reading a little bit about it, and again, this is like, I'm very new to this type of privacy concern, but for example, employers maybe using devices to monitor how alert their employees are, or schools using it to check if students are paying attention. Like, can you talk a little bit about some of the risks that we maybe face in our real everyday lives with the use of this type of technology if it's unregulated?
Yeah, absolutely. So the examples that you've provided are some of the more potentially sensitive uses of neural data or data about your nervous system, which would be regulated specifically in those contexts, maybe differently than they would in the context of consumer privacy. But you're absolutely right. Like the use of data on the job to while there could be some potential good uses. So for safety purposes to determine if someone is too tired to be performing certain tasks at work. That could be a safety benefit, but it also could be used to make a decision about personnel or hiring or firing or promotion based on pretty granular and sensitive data about the individual. And so in the workplace, on young people in schools, I think that if you any instance of particularly sensitive contexts when it comes to other kinds of data are going to apply for neural data and for neurotechnologies as well. But I think that it kind of depends on whether we're talking about a consumer privacy context, which California and Colorado are focused on consumer privacy, and Minnesota, I think, is more general. It's creating new rights, and a number of those rights actually relate to the government's relationship to an individual and their neural data. So it really kind of depends on the regulatory context that we're talking about.
Great. I want to ask you two more quick questions on Minnesota before we move on. I'm conscious of making sure I save space for everyone's topic and questions. But before I do that, I made a very big host error at the beginning, which was sort of to set up the entire premise of how we're going to talk about this with our Halloween theme. So FPF, please forgive me. Bailey, before I finish up with Jameson on this topic, can you explain to us how we're going to talk about dead bills? We have some classifications for how we're going to predict their future. Could you give us some context there?
Yes, so I think you alluded to this earlier. A dead bill is just any bill that did not pass the legislative session and become law. I don't know why that's like the terminology we use, but we use the term dead bill. And so this came about because someone talked about like bills resurrecting next sessions, or us doing like a seance for bills. So we wanted to give it kind of a spooky flavor. So I think some of the bigger categories of dead bills, actually, first, let me step back. A lot of bills die just for like no substantive reason. I think like probably 90% of the bills we see don't even get a hearing. They just get introduced. We live in our own like special privacy world, but lawmakers, they're working on privacy. They're trying to fund schools. I have like child safety, like keyword searches, and a lot of like bills I get are actually for things like car seat safety, like stuff that has nothing to do with what we work on. And so sometimes bills just die because they are just not top of the legislative priority. Sometimes they die for political reasons. Like someone might say, hey, you pass this bill, I'll let this one go, etc. And then sometimes they do not pass for like substantive reasons, or they're just like too soon. Like someone might do something really like innovative that they want to workshop over the next couple of years, and they don't realistically think it'll pass in that session. So the categories we have today are zombie bills. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about is in that zombie bill category. We expect to see the bill introduced again in some form. And then we have Frankenstein bills, like perhaps like someone likes a piece of an idea of a bill and then they can sneak it into another more substantive bill. That's something that we've seen a couple times in the last few years. In 2023, there was a Connecticut bill that I called like 3 bills in a trench coat because it was SB3, but it had a section on health, it had a section on kids, and then it had a section like a completely unrelated on like I think it was like dating apps. I want to say not an issue we like paid a close attention to, but sometimes what we are focused on is just a piece of the larger puzzle. And then we have buried bills, which are ones that are just like gone forever, never to return. I think we're less so going to talk about those today. Every bill we've talked about today, we have a reason for talking about, either because we specifically think it will return in the form of a zombie bill, or we think it's identifying like a larger trend in the space that folks should be paying attention to. So hopefully that like framing was helpful.
Yes, now that you've framed it appropriately, as I should have, I think we can move on with the conversation. It'll make more sense. Okay, so Jameson, as we wrap up on Minnesota, what was its cause of death?
Yeah, so that's a good question. This specific bill was actually the second or third or even fourth maybe time that this lawmaker has introduced the same bill in Minnesota. And I think that it's failed to gain traction for 2 main reasons. One, it's pretty forward-looking, and a lot of the other lawmakers were skeptical about whether it actually matched the state of technology. I mean, everyone knows what some lawmakers are generally like when it comes to technology. A lot of times they're playing catch up. So looking forward like this, it was maybe not necessarily a priority. At the same time, an approach that creates a whole new set of rights takes a lot of political buy-in. There are a lot of questions about what these rights would entail. So earlier I mentioned a couple of the rights that it created. Those were just 2 of the, I think there's like 5 new rights that are created under it. So there's just a lot of questions about like what they mean, how they would be enforced, the impact they would have on the tech ecosystem. And I think from a compliance standpoint, it's probably easier to deal with the California and Colorado approach, which takes existing privacy laws and expands them to cover new types of data or new uses of data, rather than an approach that just creates completely new rights for a somewhat hypothetical use of technology. So for this reason, I think that, if we see other states try to address this general concept of mental privacy, they will probably take the Colorado and California route rather than the Minnesota route.
Gotcha. Okay, and do we expect that this is going to be resurrected in some way?
Given that this is, as I mentioned, this has been introduced a couple times already, it's possible that this bill will be reintroduced by the same senator. But it's unclear. So it's possible, but it also could come back in a completely different form, such as one more closely resembling Colorado or California.
I like this lawmaker. Like, they're not about to they're just like, they're a trier, they're not about to just take their ball and go home.
He feels very strongly about this.
Yeah.
Maybe he knows something we don't.
Yeah.
He did work in tech, or works in tech, so.
What about, let's eulogize. Is there anything about this bill that you really loved that you hope comes back in a future iteration if it is reintroduced?
I'd rather not comment on the merits of the bill, if that's okay. I do appreciate that it is talking about and addressing mental privacy and neurotechnologies, and it's something that I find super interesting and something that I think is really important. And I think will only continue to become more relevant in the coming years. So I do appreciate that this was really the first in the U.S. at least to try to do something. So I appreciate that.
Great. All right. So possibly a zombie bill, possibly a Frankenstein bill that will rise again in a new version. not necessarily a berry bill put in the ground. Let's talk a little bit. Let's hear from Bailey. You're going to talk to us about Vermont.
Yes, so this past legislative session, Vermont tried to pass a comprehensive privacy law. And by that, we mean just like broad-based privacy. It's not focused on like a particular sector, like health or kids, though it did have a special kids section. And so this did ultimately fail. It passed the legislature, actually, but it was the first bill to ever be vetoed by a governor. Well, first comprehensive bill. And so that was pretty significant. And I think this is for sure one that will return in 2025.
Tell us a little bit more, if you would, about what the bill aimed to do. What was it addressing?
Sure. So everyone talks about like the privacy patchwork. Jameson, if you actually look behind his head, he has our patchwork quilt. The Vermont comprehensive law was kind of a patchwork itself. So at this point, we have 19 states that have passed comprehensive laws. Vermont was not interested in kind of copying and pasting what another state had done. They took like bits and pieces from other laws. So they kind of started with Connecticut's comprehensive law as a model, which is seen as one that's a little bit more like consumer friendly. And then they took the data minimization pieces from Maryland. They took the health sections from My Health, My Data. There was some parts about anti-discrimination that was borrowed from ADPPA. And then they had an age-appropriate design code within it. So it had a lot going on. And then in addition to that, there was a lot going on politically. So the House was very interested in passing a comprehensive bill. And then the Senate was very interested in passing an age-appropriate design code bill. So what ultimately happened is the age-appropriate design code was tacked on after the comprehensive part. So it actually made it a little hard for people on the outside that were not following closely like us to keep track, because there in the 11th hour, there are a lot of amendments and amendments to amendments. If you look at the bill page, what ultimately passed was something weird. It was like Senate substitute of a House substitute of a Senate substitute. There were a few trades that sent in veto letters that got the bill number wrong because they had not kept up with what passed. So the bill, if it had passed, would have been the furthest reaching privacy bill, I would say, though, because it just like had the most like substantive protections. It just ultimately was vetoed.
And, you know, talking a little bit about its morbidities, was the addition of the kids code getting tacked onto it what sort of put the nail in the coffin and caused the governor to veto?
You know, it was not. I don't know how I forgot to mention this. It had a private right of action.
That was it.
There it is. There it is.
So it had, so the private right of action seemed to be very important to the Vermont lawmakers, just to have another way for consumers to kind of like enforce their privacy rights. It had a very limited private right of action. So it would have only applied to large data holders. So the bill kind of like had a tiered effective date situation. So the largest companies had to comply the soonest. Medium companies had a little bit more time, and then the smallest businesses had the most leeway. So the private right of action only would have applied to large data holders, and I think it only would have applied for sensitive data or one other thing that I am forgetting. It also would have sunset after 2 years, and the legislature would have had to affirmatively reauthorize the existence of the private right of action. So they did a lot to try and kind of like create something that was like workable, but as we all know, like private right of actions are very fraught and seem to kind of often be like a nail in the coffin for bills. I think Adonne will get into that with ADPPA. But I think the private right of action was one thing. And then in terms of veto letters, yes, people reference the age appropriate design code.
Just to add on to what you were saying, Bailey, Jordan Francis commented, per Bailey's comment, the last file uploaded was, quote, Senate proposal of amendment to House proposal of amendment to Senate proposal of amendment official. It's catchy. I'll give it that. Okay, so, and I think, like, would y'all say, I mean, question for Bailey / the group, like, I've been out of the privacy space in terms of, like, directly working in it, kind of watching, you know, with one eye closed for a little bit since about March. it doesn't sound like we're getting any closer to the private right of action surviving, even with a limited scope, as you sort of outlined. It had some sort of guardrails on it, but it seems like that still is sort of the kiss of death to any type of comprehensive bill. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, caveat in this case, it did pass the legislature, both the Senate and the House passed it. It's just the governor vetoed, and there was not a veto-proof majority. So it's not the kiss of death, but I don't know if there's something like lower than kiss of death. It's still not good.
Also, that kids code thing seems to still be really problematic, or it was, the last time I checked, in terms of we have this sort of First Amendment argument that seems to crush any type of kids code that gets close. Is that sort of still the case, that it's the First Amendment arguments that are really wreaking the most havoc on any bills that aim to pass a kids code in a state?
So the Vermont one was a modified kids code. Again, so Vermont kind of started with Connecticut as like their frame of reference, and Connecticut already has heightened protections for kids that are modeled after the age appropriate design code. So it was kind of interesting to see them try to work that together, because it's like a modified AADC plus like an actual AADC. But they took away like the most like constitutionally like suspect provisions. Like, I did not see it as requiring age estimation in Vermont. I know some in this very chat might see it that way, but there was no explicit you must do age estimation. And there also were no mentions of content. Like, I think content was kind of like the word that like sparked the most like First Amendment questions in AADC. But I think there's still a lot of unsettled questions in that. So a state that like moves forward on an AADC is still like taking some level of risk. Though I will add that like Maryland age appropriate design code just went into effect. I have not yet seen a lawsuit from NetChoice or anyone else. Doesn't mean there won't be, but it's been in effect for almost a month now.
Oh, wow. I'm shocked that NetChoice hasn't jumped on that. Adonne, yeah.
Did the Vermont came before or after Maryland?
It's complicated because they were kind of working on them at the same time. Maryland passed first, and then Vermont passed after. And the Maryland AADC looks a lot like what Vermont passed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so what do you think, Bailey, if you had to characterize this, its death? Is it likely to zombie, Frankenstein, none of the above? What do you think, it's coming back as itself or another version?
I think it's 100% coming back. We don't make predictions around here, but I would be so shocked if it did not come back. Again, like just because it literally did pass the House and the Senate, I think there just might be some amendments made to it. I don't know if the private right of action will still be there, if that was the thing that was cited as being of the biggest concern. You can read like the governor veto letter to see like what parts specifically were of concern to him. I think there were like 90 something like veto letters that were sent, but I would for sure expect it to return in 2024.
Yeah, I was trying to read up on it a little bit before we chatted, and it sounds like the governor, who's a Republican, is really worried. In his letter, he says that the bill would have made Vermont a national outlier, more hostile than any other state to businesses and nonprofits. And that he appreciates that the private right is narrow in impact, but it will still negatively impact mid-sized employers and small businesses. So it sounds like if you're going to get past the governor, you're going to have to do something to that something slightly.
Yeah, and again, like I do want to reiterate, like the private right of action only applied to large data holders. So
so what's he talking about?
Yeah, I don't know which small and medium-sized businesses, but again, I'm not in-house there, so maybe they know something that I don't.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. Maybe Adonne, do you want, Bailey, anything I didn't ask you about Vermont that we should talk about?
No, I think you covered everything.
Okay, you covered everything, but thank you. Adonne, can you talk to us a little bit? You're going to talk to us about motor vehicle privacy bills, specifically one in Tennessee.
Sure. So I chose this bill, obviously vehicle just came across my scope, but I chose this bill because of the kind of nature of the bill and what it actually means in the world of privacy, and how I personally think they got this very wrong. So Tennessee House Bill 2615, the Motor Vehicle Consumer Privacy Act of 2024 was introduced like right at the top of the year. And what it did, or what it was supposed to do, was establish through the Public Utility Commission, that the commission was supposed to establish and create a database to compile a list of names and contact information of purchasers of new motor vehicles in the state who object to the use of their personal information and data by the motor vehicle manufacturer. You heard me. That means the commission will create a database who now also has to take in your information separate from when you purchase the vehicle and maintain that information and your opt-out decision. In addition, the commission could partner with a third party to host this database if they so chose. So that would mean the opposite of data minimization, in my personal opinion, and like the scope of how many people involved in your actual opt-out decision is kind of crazy. Further, it would then require that vehicle manufacturers pay the commission to receive the list of names for people who have opted out. So your faces, that is how I felt 3 times over. So the commission creates the database, who they could outsource this database to a third party who would host it, would host all of the purchasers of new vehicles opt-out consent decisions in this database. And then if a vehicle manufacturer wanted to sell or share or use any of the information around like personal data, they would have to pay a yearly fee. Is it yearly or monthly? Pay a yearly fee to access this list so that they don't violate the list. In my opinion, that feels fraught for so many reasons. There's also like no definition on new vehicle purchasers. So do we mean new vehicle as in a 2025, or do we mean new vehicle to Adonne? There's also no definition on sell or share. So how far does that go? What does that look like? I don't know, but now I still have to pay this state commission. It also only covers the state of Tennessee. So like it's super hyper specific to the state. It also requires the commission to establish rules for how manufacturers would inform individuals of the opportunity to provide an opt-out notice to the state, and would specify methods for the way that purchasers can give the notice, how they would revoke the notice. It specifies the methods by which a person can actually consent to their information being used. And then also, they must establish a length of time for the objection to last, which would then require an individual to at some point have to re-up their objection to the information to the state. And then the manufacturer would have to then re-access this list. Yeah, that's the bill. Sounds
like it's like a anti-privacy bill. Like
Yes.
It sounds very strange that it's billed as a privacy bill, and it does a lot of the wrong things from a privacy perspective. It makes all of us say, what?
Yes. It also doesn't say that, it says that if you do not pay the fee to access, so a manufacturer doesn't pay the fee to access the do not sell or release list, if they do not pay the fee and then you sell or release a purchaser's personal information, is there a violation? They said that yes, there would be a violation. So you don't really have an option but to purchase this do not sell list from the state, because you wouldn't have any, even though you likely have your own consent mechanisms that go through the manufacturer, because I don't know, you're a vehicle manufacturer who abides by so many other laws. That is not good enough. You still need Tennessee specific. So there's just a bunch of gaps, a bunch of holes. There's no private right of action either. which feels like this would be ripe for a private right of action, but it's not. So the commission would send a cease and desist and then charge for the knowing violations, which I don't know how you also show a knowing violation. And then there is a carve out for a US law, as if there's supposed to be a US law that might happen and do the same thing. So
Sure. Okay. Interesting. How did it what? How did it go for this bill? Did it see some groundswell support or what?
So it currently died. There hasn't been any movement since March, but that does not necessarily mean that it is actually dead and has been killed. It looked like there was some support in the world of vehicle privacy legislation. There were several different sorts of proposals. This was the furthest outlier, I think, for the fact that it's a vehicle privacy, but not actually privacy bill. And I think that's the thing that makes this bill so weird in the world of privacy. And so hasn't seen any movement since March. I don't think it will see any movement in the coming weeks, but that's where we are. And it's not clear to me why the movement stopped. It was removed from the committee schedule that it was on, and nothing else happened.
Yeah, okay. I think lessons learned from that one, maybe if we were to eulogize, is like if you're gonna be a privacy bill, talk to some privacy peeps when you draft it, maybe something like that. I don't know.
Probably a strong start.
Yeah.
At least have informed, I don't know, maybe don't allow the commission to have a third party, and like also assume that manufacturers already get consent. But here we are.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we wrap, we're going to wrap soon. If anyone does have questions or comments, please do ask them now. But let's just, no conversation would be complete. Also, if you want to read more about any of the bills mentioned, we've been linking them all in the chat. So feel free to read more on your own. Where are we at with ADPPA stuff? Speaking of bills that die and come back to life, where question to the group, maybe Adonne can get us started here. What's happening in that world?
Sure. ADPA was not the most recent rendition, but of course now 2-ish years ago. And every once in a while something special comes along and it's so delightful and everyone is all on board. And then sometimes, you have an antagonist who's not quite on board. So ADPA came around, and one of the reasons that it was well-rounded was because it really had strong bipartisan support. It's supposed to be our comprehensive federal privacy legislation. In a previous lifetime, when I worked on it, one of the big things that we supported about it, it included and advanced the civil rights protections, which notably were removed most recently from the APRA rendition for federal privacy legislation, but provided civil rights protections online by prohibiting discriminatory uses of personal data. It also had two things, which I can let Bailey dig into a bit more, that could have led to its demise. The preemption was definitely a sticking point, and the private right of action. There was a little bit of tussle on kind of where it placed the FTC here as well, but I'll let Bailey talk about those two particular sticking points.
Bailey?
Yeah, so as I alluded to earlier, private right of action is, I think, one of the most fraught areas of privacy legislation. Just the question of can individuals bring a lawsuit, or can it only be enforced by the Attorney General or other entities, like California's agency? On one hand, I think proponents of them would say that it gives citizens a better avenue to enforce their rights. AGs have a lot on their plate. Again, they don't live in a privacy bubble that we do. They have a lot of other consumer protection issues to deal with. And then critics of PRAs would say, this is just going to incentivize plaintiffs' attorneys to go out, bring a bunch of lawsuits, and it's not actually going to help consumers. So I don't think that PRA issue has been settled yet at the federal level. And then the preemption question is also very challenging still. I think a lot of people that want a federal privacy law want a one standard across the board, and they want it to be preemptive going forward. On the other hand, 19 states have passed privacy laws that may or may not want them to go away. I think California is the one that's most vocal about the fact that they want their law to stay in place. I think other states perhaps are more agnostic to the cause. And I don't remember where APRA left off on both of these questions, if I'm being honest, because I looked at it in May and then stopped thinking about it after June, after like that canceled. I've been burned too many times.
So this is what I want to ask the group. Like, I get frustrated because as someone who was tracking the space, reporting on the space for a long time, gauging reactions, like, it ends up being this thing where you like get people either nervous or excited because there's some news that another bill is dropping and we've got 3 corners or we got 4 corners or like 12 corners. And it's just like, I always get mad, and I've turned into a real cynic about it because I'm like, we're going to spend all of these resources and time and energy and like nights, researching bills, gauging opinions, having multiple panels and sessions about it and LinkedIn Lives. And then it just seems like we're never any closer to agreement on preemption and private right of action. Like, no matter how many times we do these fire drills about getting excited about it, like, do y'all think we're any closer? Please feel free to say yes and tell me I'm wrong. Do y'all think we're any closer, or are we just gonna like in 5 years still be having this conversation about like, is this the year for federal privacy?
I think I will say that it is not a coincidence that most of the bills we talked about today are state bills rather than federal bills. So that will be my non-answer. Jameson, what do you think?
I also have a non-answer, but I don't make predictions, so I really have no idea. I actually have a question for you, Bailey, if I can, on private right of action. Is there any obviously, there are a lot of people who think that a private right of action would, lead to a lot of superfluous lawsuits, and it would be really bad for companies. But is it an all or nothing kind of thing, or can there be, something structural done to prevent, like certain protections against superfluous lawsuits, or limiting the private right of action to specific elements and not for the whole thing that might assuage some of the concerns that people have about it?
So I do not think it is an all or nothing proposition. I think Vermont kind of showed that they said they limited it to sensitive data violations, and one other one that I still have not remembered. We have a Vermont blog that someone can link to in the chat that I think goes through the blog in really great detail. But again, Vermont scoped the type of infringements that can take place and who would be liable. And then I think another way that private right of actions can be scoped that has become a debate is whether it's a per se violation, whether you just because you did not comply with the law, you are by default in violation and liable, or if someone would still have to kind of make a case and say okay, my rights were violated because of XYZ, and also I was harmed in this way. I think I don't want to go down the standing rabbit hole. That's a whole separate privacy academic rabbit hole to go down. But I think there have been standing questions in privacy law. And so I think that also is why the private right of action debate is really hard to have, because it's hard to just say okay, go make your case why your privacy rights were violated, because what does privacy even mean? What does a privacy violation even mean? It's a very amorphous concept and not always tied to financial harms. But the simple answer is no, I do not think it is an all or nothing proposition. It's just, what does that look like is very hard. And so far, the greatest minds of our time have not solved the issue.
All right. I think we're ready to wrap. Any final thoughts from speakers that you want to toss out there? You feel like we covered it?
I think we covered it.
Bonnie's answer is to the.
I would say, if I could, I don't know that it's a prediction, but I don't think the conversation on comprehensive privacy is going anywhere. I think there's a good chance that it will continue to look a few different ways. I think, like we have pointed out, both Jameson and I have been looking at specific sectors, and we've seen privacy come up there. And so I think it is going to continue to be something that is tackled maybe comprehensively, maybe more sectorally specific at the federal level. I'm not sure, but it's not something that is just going to be put to rest. I do think, what is the categories? I think we're likely to see more Frankenstein-style privacy bills moving forward. Almost Vermont kind of sounds like maybe how people are going to start hodgepodging these things together. But that would be my one takeaway.
And then I would just add, even if we don't think we're going to see something at the federal level, we might see parts of ADPPA or APRA within state bills. Like, so Maryland passed some data minimization provisions that look similar to ADPPA. I think the prohibitions on discriminatory processing in Vermont, that came from ADPPA. So keep an eye out for how federal privacy law might show up in the states.
All right. Amazing. Let's wrap it up. I want to say thanks so much to FPF for hosting, Megan and Jordan, who are behind the scenes but helped put this on. Adonne, Jameson, and Bailey, always love chatting with y'all and appreciate so much your expertise on the subject and your willingness to talk about it. Tatiana Rice at FPF was her brain baby a few years back, so we're happy to keep up the tradition. Thanks so much for having me on to host the convo. And I would say to everyone watching, feel free to click those resource links in the chat, and also stay tuned for more FPF LinkedIn Lives, which I know y'all do pretty regularly, and we're all grateful that you do. Happy Halloween. Enjoy trick-or-treating with the kids or as an adult, whatever you do. We respect your choices. Have a great rest of your Thursday, whatever it is. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Angelique.